Hi spooky friends, welcome back to Kelly Does Stuff. Today we are going to make a skull cave with a cooler from the dollar store. We're not going to use the top. We're going to use this to construct our cave. I've been wanting to do this for a while, and a couple years ago I tried and way overcomplicated it, and it was a big no, it didn't work out. Since then, I have created cave-like things. I created a structure, a platform for a Limax mine piece that I have, and then I also created something cave-like for the Zombie Jazz Cafe. But I've really been wanting to do a cave that has a skull, and I actually have no idea where I'm gonna put this. I have a couple different ideas for displays. I have like a gothic section that I want to work on and a pirate section that I don't really have pieces for, but I'm gonna get some one day. But I was like, we don't need to wait until we know what we're gonna do with it. We could just make the cave. And so I did, and let's do it.
Here is the cooler that I am going to use, and this is the skull that I got at the dollar store. It was part of a floral pick. It had some flowers and other stuff on it that I just pulled off. And here's all our scrap styrofoam. The pink is the XPS foam that I love and use all the time. The white is EPS. That one does make a mess because it leaves behind all of those little balls, but both will work for the project. The first thing I want to do is transform the rectangle opening of my cooler into the arched opening of my cave. And I just happen to have a couple pieces of EPS foam that were a good shape and size for me to work with. I also wanted to mark off where I was going to be placing my skull. That way I didn't hot glue my EPS foam in the wrong spot onto the cooler. I'm going to carve out a little bit of an arch on each side of the cooler here to create this opening. There is nothing precise or exact about this, at least not for me. You know me. I don't measure. We're just kind of going with what feels right. But definitely, if you like to measure and want it precise, go for it. This cave can be anything that you want. I'm gonna work with my hot glue gun on the low setting because hot glue, if it gets really hot and bubbly, it will eat through foam, and it seems like that EPS foam will start to melt at a lower temperature than the XPS foam. And now we're just gonna add more pieces of foam to build the mouth of the cave. I found toothpicks pretty helpful in attaching pieces while that glue was cooling, particularly those EPS pieces if any of those edges kind of had that crumbly texture to them. Speaking of that crumbly, bumpy surface, you can use your blade or a hot wire tool if you have it to cut it in a way to reduce the amount of bumpiness to it. Particularly a hot wire tool will help with that. But you know me, I did not have the patience for that, so we're going with bumpy. Before I secure that skull in place, I'm going to keep testing out the position and just kind of make my adjustments to my styrofoam so that way it will fit exactly where I want it to when that time comes. Okay, now I'm going to work on the inside of the cave, and one of the first things that I want to do is create a couple of smooth ledges to set on the floor of the cave there. I don't know what I'm going to put in this cave, but I thought maybe I might want to add some figurines that are going to have a smooth surface for them to stand up on. Now, I do really think it would have been easier to work on the inside of the cave before closing off that opening like I just did to create the arch. But if you've hung out with me before, you know that rarely do I like to do things in any sort of efficient manner. I'm also kind of thinking that it might be easier to cut off that panel of styrofoam that's going to be the floor of the cave while we are working on adding the rocks to the inside of the cave, and then later when we go in and plaster things. This did become a little bit of a challenge to work inside of such a small space. One thing I did manage to think of ahead of time is my light. I want the cave to be lit from the inside, and so I'm going to carve a circle, a hole, in the back of my display, and I'm going to use this light by Limax, or at least at this point, that's what I was thinking of. An X-Acto knife here will work fine. This is pretty thin foam, so it's not going to fight you very much, although it always helps to have a very sharp blade. If you've got those hot wire tools, go ahead and break those out if you like working with those. So now it's time to add our styrofoam stones. These can be any shape or size that you want them to. You could be very exact in how you carve them. You could just break up your foam, or you can grab your scraps exactly as they are and hot glue them onto your cave. All right, let's see what I've got. I kind of went with some more medium-sized rocks, and then in some places you can see that I glued some smaller rocks on top. That to me just added a little bit more dimension to these rocks. You can also see that mine are pretty close together. Some of them kind of overlap each other, but you could certainly create bigger rocks and have them spaced further out if that's the look that you like. I'm going to move on to the XPS foam for the rocks on the outside of the cave, and the main reason for this is because this foam just doesn't make the mess that the EPS foam does as I'm carving the rocks. I feel like I should mention that it does look like I'm having a really hard time carving this foam, and that is because I didn't protect my counter very well. All I have underneath me is this cardboard, and I am so afraid of scratching up my counter, so I'm kind of holding this foam in the air as I carve it. It's ridiculous, and once again, I'm not doing things totally efficiently. If you protect your surfaces and have a sharp blade, this foam should cut pretty easily. This XPS foam I think is 1 inch thick, and just remember that you can shape these rocks to be any size that you want, so you can cut your foam in half or quarters or thirds to adjust the thickness as well as the size. I've mentioned hot wire tools. I'll mention them again because they can be great for carving. Break those out if you have them and you like working with them. I have them. I like working with them, but most of the time, no matter what I'm doing with my villages, I am working with a blade. And I want to mention that because if you are just getting into this and you don't have all these tools that you see people have, or you've been into it for a long time, but you're just like, I don't want to get all these tools. I am telling you guys, a blade is like my favorite thing, and you can do so much with it. I want the top of the cave to be like a semicircle or like an arch, and I had the idea that I could use a piece of pool noodle to help create the arch. And I'll be honest, I don't know if this really added all that much to the design, but what it did do was help me follow the shape as I was gluing individual pieces of my styrofoam rocks. So this could be helpful to you. You might decide you could just skip this. The toothpicks here were really important to help keep this noodle in place while that glue dried. Before I went too much further with my rocks, I wanted to put my skull permanently in place. And before I did that, I wanted to cut a hole in the back of the skull because this is where I'm going to put some lights. I just use a blade for this, and it cut pretty easily. Again, this is from the dollar store. It's just pretty thin plastic. It almost cut a little bit too easily. Next, I rotated an X-Acto knife into those eye sockets a few times. That created a pretty good circle cutout that is going to allow the light to pass through the eyes. Now, spoiler alert, this plastic was so thin that when I actually put the light in there, it lit up the whole skull, which I thought was pretty cool. I'm going to insert a toothpick at the bottom of the skull there, add some hot glue both to the skull and to the cave, and then insert it in place. And then we get back at it again, gluing more and more and more rocks in place. Once we have all our rocks in place, it is time to plaster. I want to show you my plaster bowl. I never rinse it out. This is leftover plaster from previous projects. I use some plaster sheets, and when you use those sheets, it's going to leave behind little bits of plaster in that bowl that creates kind of a paste once you re-wet the plaster that you can use to fill in some of the grid lines of the plaster, and I'll show you that as we get into it. I'm unrolling a new pack of plaster here, and so I'm going to unroll it over the bowl because that's going to drop some loose plaster into the bowl and help contribute to that paste that we're going to want to use to fill in the grid lines of our plaster. You're going to fill your bowl with water and then just cut your plaster into whatever size sheets that are good for you to work with. I tend to go on the smaller side, I think. You're going to dip an individual sheet of that plaster into your water and then press it onto your project. You really want to make sure that you are molding the plaster around each individual rock, pressing into any holes or spaces between the rocks. Otherwise, your plaster is just going to kind of drape over your piece and it's not really going to look like rocks anymore. And this can take a little bit of time. I always work with gloves, and so sometimes that plaster wants to keep sticking to the glove and the little piece of plaster will come in and out of the hole, and you just kind of have to work with it a little bit to get it to do what you want. Every time I add a new sheet of plaster, I like to overlap with the previous sheet of plaster a little bit. I am not particularly concerned about totally smoothing out the plaster. I do like to smooth out those grid lines, but I kind of like some bumps in the plaster, some cracks, a little bit of grittiness. I think that adds some really good texture that's going to make these rocks look more realistic when it's time to paint them. Okay, I think you can see that grid that I'm talking about here as I try to work with this plaster. Now, a lot of times you can fill in the grid a little bit just from the plaster itself that's still on the sheet and not stretching your plaster too far. So don't try to cover too many rocks at one time with the plaster. Allow that plaster to do the best coverage on the rocks where you are placing it. Okay, here's the bowl with all of that plaster that's kind of the paste now at the bottom of it. If you have pieces that are still kind of crumbly and not pasty from your leftover project, crumble it up under the water. It will soften, and then just scoop up. You don't want any of the thick crumbles, but you want to scoop up some of that pasty plaster. This is very technical and scientific, so that you can smooth it into those grid holes. And just like we did with gluing the rocks, we are repeating the plaster process over and over and over again. Here you might be able to see a little bit of that gritty texture I was talking about. Sometimes when you pull up that plaster, it's not totally pasty, it's a little bit gritty, and I really like that, again, because I think it provides great texture, but that's totally up to you. You can completely smooth this out if you want to. Even though I don't know where I'm going to display this, I'm not going to do a whole lot of work on the back of the display because I have a feeling you're not going to see it. So I want to save my materials for things that you will see. I am just going to cover the pool noodle in plaster. I think it will make it a little bit easier to paint. It was definitely a challenge to work on the inside of the cave. Now, if you have the patience, an option could be is to do the entire inside of the cave first. Do all of your styrofoam rocks, plaster it completely, let it dry, paint it, and then do all of the outside, including forming the mouth of the cave, that opening, and then adding your rocks, kind of doing it as two completely separate processes. I never have the patience for that stuff. I will always choose difficulty over patience. Somehow I made it work. It's not pretty, but it's gonna work. Once this was completely dry, which took a couple days, I went in with a black acrylic base coat. Now, you may be wondering, what about spray paint? Yes, you can definitely use spray paint on your piece. Just make sure that you have completely covered it with the plaster or protect any exposed areas of styrofoam because spray paint will eat through foam. I know that I did not do a thorough covering with the plaster, especially on the inside, so spray paint wasn't an option for me, but I gotta be honest, you guys, I just really love painting. Like, this part is very enjoyable and relaxing to me, so even when spray paint is an option, I rarely use it. Although once I got to painting the inside, I wish I could use the spray paint. That became a challenge. I have heard that there are foam-friendly spray paints. Anytime I have tried to use a product like that, it has not been all that friendly. It's been rude and eaten my foam. So if you know of a good product that you've had success with, leave it in the comments so we can all know. Okay, now I'm gonna go in with a dark gray paint. I typically do brown rocks, but for this project I wanted to switch it up a little bit, so I'm gonna do shades of gray, and I'm gonna do a pretty thorough coating of this dark color. The black that's gonna be left behind is more just gonna be kind of those shadows and show you where there might be like recesses and holes in the rock. So It is kind of a dry brushing technique in that we're not totally covering it like we did the black paint, but you can see I'm just kind of brushing over the surface and pulling out the interesting parts of the rock. When that was completely dry, I wanted to experiment with some mid-tone colors, and for this piece, I'm gonna go with blues, purples, and pinks. And I am randomly applying this. At this stage, I'm trying not to think too much about where every color is going to go. The idea is so much of this is going to be covered because we're going to go back in with a lighter gray dry brushing technique. So you're really not going to see a lot of this. You're just going to kind of see some colors poking through. It's just going to break up a lot of that gray and make it a little bit more interesting. And what I want to say here is do anything that you want, any colors that you want, any style that you want. Some people might say, that's not very realistic. And listen, we live in the real world. I live in reality all the time. I like Halloween because it's my escape, and creating is also an escape. So you can make it look incredibly realistic if you want to. Look at pictures of rocks, think of rocks that you've seen in real life to get some inspiration if you're going for a realistic look, or make it totally fantasy. These could be like bright pink sparkly rocks. Just do whatever you want, and if you're new at this, give yourself permission to experiment because you can always fix stuff. If there are colors that you don't like, just go back, paint it black, and start over again. Once I'm done with all those colors, I'm gonna go in with a lighter gray and I'm gonna just lighten up all of the rocks overall. I'm gonna get most of that paint off my brush and we're gonna do that dry brushing technique, and you're gonna see that I'm gonna cover up a lot of those colors. So when it's done, you're just gonna see hints of color peeking through. And I actually kind of repeat the whole process a couple of times. It started to look a little too gray in uniform, so I went back and added some of that blue, a little bit of purple to the rocks that I covered up a little bit too much. And some of the rocks themselves, I went in and painted them a bluish gray color, even added some black back in, just to make the rocks a little bit more interesting. And to further help individual rocks pop, I am going in with a light gray, even white brushing here. This is the lightest dry brushing that I am doing. Very little paint on a very dry brush, getting most of it off and going very lightly around the edges of rocks and any lines and bumps that I want to highlight. You can kind of start to see where individual rock is popping here a little bit. So I am being more particular and decisive. I'm being decisive about where I'm applying this paint. So much of the other painting I do, I kind of just like to be a little bit random. If I overthink it, it just doesn't work out. But this, I am really trying to be a little bit more intentional about where I'm applying my lightest shades. And here I go again, adding more dark paint. And then I'll go back in with the light paint. Repeat forever. And the inside is the exact same thing, and I'm just showing you proof. I did it with a brush. It was a challenge, and I absolutely wish I had given myself a spray paint option, but here's where we were, and we got it done. Okay, this next part, some of you may hate, but I added sparkles to the inside. Now, I don't need an excuse ever to add sparkles to anything, but this was a little bit strategic. I didn't add a lot of the blues and purples. I actually didn't add any of that to the inside. I didn't think you were going to see it, but I thought a little sparkle might help make the inside more interesting once we put the light inside. I just thought it would look really like flat without some shimmer. I don't know. That was my excuse to use sparkles. I just wanted to do it. If you hate sparkles, just don't do this part. But you may want to think about a way to have your inside pop and be interesting. You could do that by adding a metallic gloss or satin finish paint. I'm going to use this metallic silver on the outside of the cave. I'm also going to use a satin white, mix those together. This is a super dry brushing technique, and I'm just going to kind of hit the edges of the rocks and any of those raised surfaces that I really want to highlight. It's just going to give it a little bit of a sheen. Even though I don't know where or how I'm going to display this, I have a feeling it's going to be water on the inside of the cave. It could be sand with like a buried treasure pirate thing, but probably water. So I'm going to do just a super fast blue paint job on the bottom. Nothing fancy, nothing artistic, just to give us a little bit of a finished look right now. And our skeleton was looking a little rough, and so I went back in and added some black to the eyes and nose. And then I want to add some more color to the skeleton. I want to add some browns and greens, just kind of make it look like it is old and weathered and been a part of this rock for a really long time. I'm going to add the brown and the green as more of a wash. So I'm going to dip my paintbrush in some water and then add it into the paint and kind of get that paint really diluted. Then I'm just going to let it kind of run over the skull, let the paint kind of do what it wants and follow any natural grooves that are on that skull. And then finally I added some black paint all the way around the skull. This just kind of helped it stand out a little bit more from the rocks. That's it, friends. We have a skull cave. Now, I kind of wanted to see what it might look like in a display. Obviously, this doesn't totally go together. I just kind of grabbed some random things, but it does sort of give me an idea. I might be leaning towards a pirate display for this cave. One thing I will be doing when it's time to set this up is replacing that purple Limax light that I put in the back of the display. You can see that it does not light up the cave at all. It's very dark. And I actually took that light out and just stuck some purple string lights in the back just so we could kind of see the inside of the cave right now. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you found a few things that could be helpful for your own cave displays. Please consider giving this video a like, and if you have not already subscribed to my channel, I would love it so very much. I look forward to seeing you guys next time, and happy creating!